I'm wondering, why have you chosen Sukarno, the first president of independent Indonesia? Because he's obviously not the first historical figure that comes to mind when one thinks about aggressors, especially in the European historical context.
The first reason is that it is impossible to write the history of Europe, especially in the 19th and 18th, 19th and 20th century, without including the colonial dimension. Most European states from the 18th to the 20th century have been imperial states, and it's not advisable to divorce themselves these colonial dimensions from the, let's say, strictly European dimension, because they are intertwined. They are really inseparable. It was possible for me, taking Sukarno as an example, to illustrate the inseparability of national and colonial history.
One of the things that Sukarno, of course, also is intertwined with is the history of the Second World War, where Indonesia was occupied by the Japanese Empire, and Sukarno was one could say, collaborator. I think it would be interesting if you could talk a little bit more about how this relates to the aggressor, and maybe how this also relates to other aggressive figures like the Japanese.
The question whether Sukarno and the other national Indonesian leaders can be branded as collaborators is highly contentious. You can only be a collaborator when the ones with whom you collaborate are the enemy of your own people. This was not the case when the Japanese conquered Dutch East Indies. Many Indonesians welcomed the Japanese in 1942 when they landed. But the Dutch take on it was completely different. They simply framed the Indonesian national movement as a Japanese setup. Declaration of Indonesian independence was seen as the last trick that fascist Japan played on the Dutch.
The Netherlands was not the only European country that was bitterly resisting the decolonisation process. So what makes the decolonization of the Dutch East Indies different?
Peculiar of the decolonization of Indonesia has been the length of this process. We are talking about a period of 16 to 17 years. Most people think it ended in December 1949. Then Indonesia was declared independent. That Indonesia was not completely decolonized in 1950. The Dutch tried to hang on to Dutch New Guinea, although it was pretty much obvious that, given the worldwide process of decolonization, this would be a mission impossible.
How did the perception of Sukarno change through the context of the Cold War?
Sukarno gave the most important impetus for the Third World movement, the non-aligned countries. The West, by the way, including the states, were highly suspicious of this movement of non-aligned countries because they suspected that it would be a communist bloc under a different guise. In the course of the 50s, it was becoming clear that the Dutch were not planning to leave West Irian, and this made Sukarno move more in the direction of China and the Soviet Union. Then he was increasingly branded or framed as a communist. Nobody was talking about fascism anymore. Of course, the former Western allies had their reasons to become silent about fascism, because West Germany and Japan had become part of the big global alliance.
What role does Sukarno play nowadays in the general public perception in the Netherlands, but maybe also in schools?
Most of the European nations who had sizable colonial empires, England, France, Portugal, were reinventing themselves after they lost their colonies as, let's say, national states. I mean, this is an interesting phenomenon in national historiography, that when the parts of the former colonial empires became independent, the history of these empires lost public interest. You cannot argue that there is a widely spread public image of Sukarno nowadays, because there is not a widespread image of the former Dutch Indies nowadays.
At the same time, we see some signs of this colonial reckoning. You have also written in your articles about some court cases where victims of Dutch colonial rule got reparations, their suffering was acknowledged. The Dutch government also offered some official apologies. Maybe you could tell us, how do you think this Dutch approach of coping with this very unpleasant past, how will it evolve in the future?
There are several global developments that are important for the future. On the one side, starting in the 1990s, this increasing importance of international law and of the human rights ideology, you can say. Only due to this development, colonialism and slavery became political problems in the West. The very idea that former colonial powers are responsible for, let's say, historical injustices has been very recent. What we are witnessing now, I fear, is the end of this development. The future of coping with a problematic past in Western states is very much dependent on how successful populism will be in the long term. At the moment, I see little or no indications that the human rights ideology is able to resist this rise of populism. We may well have Dutch government with a different populist flavor, but pursuing the same politics. In that case, I don't see much room for human rights inspired policies, including the coping with the colonial past.